See, ladies, see, if you don't want this phone, I will throw you with it. So ladies,
how did I come so close to getting what I wanted, and then I just...
She never expected to find out like this. Not in the middle of an airport lounge. Not with her heart pounding so loud she could barely hear the announcements overhead. But there it was, Rick's phone. Screen lit up. A message from the one person Trisha had begged him to cut off for good. Her hands shook as she scrolled, each word burning a hole through the trust she'd spent months patching together. Rick, who had sworn he was done with secrets, was right back in the shadows, and Trisha's world tilted on its axis. The look on her face said it all. Shock, betrayal, and a kind of heartbreak that doesn't make a sound at first. Just a cold, hollow ache that spreads through your chest. Rick tried to snatch the phone back, but it was too late. The truth was out, and there was no way to stuff it back into the dark. If you're new here, I'm Aliva, and this is Reality Sport, where we don't just spill the tea, we serve it boiling. Subscribe if you want the real story, and drop your wildest theory in the comments, because this one's about to get messy. Trisha's mind raced back to the night before, when everything seemed almost perfect. Her family had gathered around the dinner table, eyes fixed on Rick, waiting for him to answer the question that had been hanging in the air since he landed. Would he give Trisha the future she deserved? Or was he just another tourist passing through her life? Her father's voice was steady but sharp, the kind that doesn't leave room for games. In their world, marriage isn't just about love, it's about legacy. About children, about building something that lasts. Rick smiled, nodded, danced around the question, but never quite landed on an answer. He talked about needing more time, about wanting to be sure. But everyone at that table knew what was really happening. Rick was stalling, and Trisha's family could smell it. The pressure was real, and it wasn't just about tradition. Trisha's family had seen men like Rick before. Charming, full of promises, but always with one foot out the door. They wanted a commitment, not a maybe. They wanted to know that their daughter wouldn't be left waiting, hoping, or worse, heartbroken. Rick's evasiveness wasn't just frustrating, it was a warning sign, and Trisha felt it in her bones. Still, she wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that this time, things would be different, that Rick would step up and prove everyone wrong. But now, staring at those messages, Trisha realized she'd been holding on to hope with both hands, even as the ground crumbled beneath her. The words on Rick's phone weren't just a slip. They were a confession, proof that his loyalty was as thin as the excuses he'd been feeding her family. The messages weren't even clever, just desperate, full of old memories and empty promises. The kind of thing you send when you want to keep your options open. Trisha's stomach twisted as she read them, each line a reminder that Rick was still playing both sides, still refusing to choose. What exactly had Rick promised her family? Was it ever real, or was he just saying what they wanted to hear? Why did he keep dodging the question about kids, about marriage, about a future? And if he was so sure about Trisha, why was he still talking to the woman who nearly destroyed them the first time? The questions piled up, each one heavier than the last, and Trisha felt herself slipping under the weight. She looked up at Rick, searching his face for any sign of regret, any flicker of honesty, but all she saw was panic. He started to explain, to spin another story, but Trisha had heard enough. Her voice was steady, but her hands were trembling as she held out the phone. If you have nothing to hide, let me see everything. Rick hesitated, and in that split second, Trisha knew the answer. The trust was gone, and all that was left was the truth, raw and undeniable, staring her in the face. The air in the family's living room was thick with expectation, every eye fixed on Rick as if waiting for him to crack. Trisha's dad sat at the head of the table, his hands folded, his gaze steady and unblinking. Next to him, Trisha's uncle leaned forward, elbows on his knees, the kind of posture that says, "We're not leaving until we get an answer." Trisha sat between them, her fingers twisting nervously in her lap, caught between hope and dread. Rick tried to keep his cool, but the sweat on his brow betrayed him. He'd faced tough crowds before, but nothing like this. Nothing like a family determined to protect their own. The question was simple, but the stakes couldn't be higher. Would Rick have children with Trisha? Not someday, not maybe, but yes or no, right now. No more dodging, no more vague promises. Trisha's dad laid it out plain. In their family, in their culture, marriage means building a future. And that future starts with kids. If Rick wasn't ready to commit, there was no point in pretending. The silence stretched, heavy and uncomfortable, as Rick searched for a way out. He talked about needing more time, about wanting to be sure, about how he and Trisha hadn't known each other long enough to make such a big decision. But every word sounded thinner than the last, and Trisha's family wasn't buying it. Trisha's uncle cut through the noise, his voice low but firm. You have to decide. Yes or no. If no, you and Trisha cannot be together. The ultimatum hung in the air, impossible to ignore. Trisha's heart pounded in her chest, her eyes locked on Rick, silently begging him to choose her, to choose their future. But Rick hesitated, his mind racing for an escape. He tried to charm, to deflect, but the family's patience was gone. They'd heard enough stories, enough excuses. They wanted an answer, and they wanted it now. Rick looked at Trisha, saw the hope in her eyes, the fear that he might walk away. He felt the walls closing in, the pressure mounting with every second of silence. Finally, he took a deep breath and said what everyone wanted to hear. I want to make you happy. I want you to feel like your life is complete. So I have to say yes. Relief washed over Trisha, her shoulders sagging as if a weight had been lifted. Her dad and uncle exchanged a glance, their expressions softening, but the audience at home could see what Trisha couldn't. The cracks in Rick's promise, the way his eyes darted, the way his voice wavered. But Rick wasn't done. He added a twist, a condition that changed everything. I'll give you all of that. Everything I just promised. But I want something from you too. Our relationship has to continue to be as good as it has been for the last few days. On the surface, it sounded reasonable, even sweet. But underneath, it was a trap. Rick was shifting the goalposts, making his commitment conditional, giving himself an out if things ever got tough. If Trisha slipped up, if the relationship hit a rough patch, he could always say she hadn't held up her end of the bargain. Trisha, desperate for hope, clung to his words. She smiled, tears in her eyes, believing that Rick had finally chosen her, finally chosen their future. Her family, too, seemed satisfied, offering their blessing, their approval, their trust. But for anyone watching, the doubts lingered. Was Rick sincere? Or was he just saying what he needed to say to get through the night? Was this a real promise, or another way to buy time, to keep his options open? Later, alone in the guest room, Rick let the mask slip. He admitted quietly that he felt bullied into making a decision, that the pressure had been too much. He told himself he'd done what he had to do, that he'd made the right choice, but the doubt in his voice was impossible to miss. Trisha, meanwhile, slept with a smile on her face, dreaming of a future that might never come, unaware that the foundation she was building on was already starting to crack. Trisha woke up with a lightness she hadn't felt in months, the kind that makes you believe anything is possible. She moved through her family's house with a new energy, hugging her dad a little tighter, laughing with her uncle over breakfast, soaking in every detail as if she could bottle this feeling and carry it with her. For the first time, she let herself picture a real future with Rick, wedding photos on the wall, a baby's laughter echoing through the rooms, her family gathered around a table that kept growing year after year. The pain and uncertainty of the past seemed to fade, replaced by hope so bright it almost hurt to look at. Her family's blessing felt like a shield, proof that love could win if you fought hard enough. Rick watched her from across the room, a smile plastered on his face, but inside, his thoughts were a tangled mess. He replayed the night before, the pressure, the ultimatum, the way he'd said yes because it was easier than saying no. He wondered if he'd made a promise he couldn't keep, if he'd just set himself up for a future he wasn't sure he wanted. The idea of starting over, of raising another child, of being tied down in a way he hadn't planned, gnawed at him. He told himself he cared about Trisha, that he wanted her to be happy. But the truth was harder to admit. Was he really ready for this? Or was he just buying time, hoping something would change before he had to follow through? As they packed their bags and said their goodbyes, Rick found a new card to play. He told Trisha's dad that before they could start a family, they needed to get her visa sorted, that the process would take months, maybe even a year. He promised to propose by the end of August, to start the paperwork, to do everything by the book. Trisha's dad nodded, satisfied with the plan, and Trisha clung to the timeline like a lifeline. She wanted to believe Rick was serious, that he was finally taking steps toward their future, that all the waiting and worrying had been worth it. But for anyone watching, the cracks were already showing. Rick's plan bought him time, gave him an excuse to delay, to keep things in limbo while he figured out what he really wanted. Trisha, blinded by hope, missed the warning signs. The way Rick's eyes darted when he talked about the future. The way he changed the subject when things got too real. The way he always seemed to have a reason to wait. Was this the start of something real? Or just another stall? Another way to keep Trisha close without ever fully committing? The drive to the airport was quiet at first, the city lights blurring past the windows as Trisha stared out, lost in thought. She wanted to believe in happy endings, in second chances, in the power of love to change even the most stubborn heart. But somewhere deep down, a small voice whispered doubts she couldn't ignore. She turned to Rick, her voice soft but steady, and asked the question that had been haunting her since the night before. "I'm ready to have a baby. But what if you change your mind?" The words hung in the air, heavy and unspoken, as Rick searched for an answer that would keep her hope alive a little longer. The airport was buzzing with restless travelers, the kind of place where time seems to stretch and every emotion feels sharper. Trisha and Rick sat side by side, but the space between them felt wider than ever. Their flight was delayed, and the hours dragged on, each minute adding to the tension that had been simmering since they left her family's house. Trisha tried to distract herself, scrolling through her phone, but her mind kept circling back to Rick's promises, the way he'd looked at her father and said all the right things. She wanted to believe him, to trust that this time would be different, but something in her gut wouldn't let her rest. Rick, on the other hand, was fidgety, checking his phone every few minutes, glancing at the departure board, tapping his foot. He tried to make small talk, but his words felt forced, empty, like he was reading from a script he didn't believe in. Trisha watched him out of the corner of her eye, noticing the way he seemed distracted, the way he kept his phone close, never letting it out of his hand. The unease grew, a slow burn that turned into a spark, then a flame. Without warning, Trisha turned to him, her voice sharper than she intended. "Let me see your phone." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, everything stopped. Rick froze, his eyes wide, caught off guard. He tried to laugh it off, to play it cool, but Trisha didn't back down. She reached for the phone, her hand steady, her eyes locked on his. Rick hesitated, clutching the phone tighter, and in that instant, Trisha knew. The trust they'd been trying to rebuild shattered, the pieces falling around them in silence. She took the phone, her hands trembling as she unlocked it. The screen lit up, and there it was, a message from Rick's ex, the same woman who had nearly destroyed their relationship before. Trisha's breath caught in her throat as she scrolled through the conversation, each line a fresh wound. The messages weren't just friendly, they were intimate, full of old memories and longing, the kind of words you say for someone you can't let go of. Rick had told her he was done with the past, that he was ready to move forward. But the truth was right there in black and white. Trisha's heart pounded as she read the messages, her vision blurring with tears. She felt sick, betrayed, foolish for believing that things could ever change. Rick tried to explain, his voice desperate, but the words sounded hollow. He said his ex had reached out first, that he was only being polite, that nothing had happened. But Trisha saw through the excuses, saw the way he avoided her eyes, the way he twisted the story to make himself look innocent. She remembered all the times Rick had accused her of being too close to her own ex, the jealousy, the arguments, the double standard that now felt like a cruel joke. The pain was sharp, raw, a mix of anger and heartbreak that left Trisha struggling to breathe. She thought about her family, about the promises Rick had made, about the future she'd been so sure of just hours before. It all felt like a lie, a story she told herself to keep from facing the truth. Rick wasn't ready to change, wasn't ready to let go of the past, wasn't ready to be the man she needed him to be. The realization hit her like a wave, knocking the air from her lungs. Rick kept talking, trying to justify, to minimize, to shift the blame. He said the messages weren't sexual, that he was only reminiscing, that he didn't mean anything by it. But Trisha knew better. She knew that emotional cheating could hurt just as much as the physical kind, that trust once broken is almost impossible to repair. She wondered how many other secrets Rick was hiding, how many other conversations he'd had behind her back, how many times he'd chosen himself over their relationship. The airport around them faded into the background, the noise and chaos swallowed by the storm raging between them. Trisha's hands shook as she handed the phone back, her voice barely above a whisper. "I can't do this." She stood up, grabbing her bag, her movements quick and determined. Rick reached for her, panic in his eyes, but she pulled away, her face set with a resolve he hadn't seen before. She walked away, her head held high, leaving Rick alone in the crowded terminal, surrounded by strangers but more isolated than ever. Rick watched her go, his mind racing, his heart pounding with fear. He realized, maybe for the first time, that he might have pushed Trisha too far, that this time there might be no coming back. The weight of his choices settled on his shoulders, heavy and unforgiving. He wanted to call out, to run after her, to beg for another chance, but the words caught in his throat. He was left with nothing but regret. The echo of Trisha's footsteps fading into the distance. The questions hung in the air, unanswered and urgent. How many other secrets was Rick hiding? How many more lies would come to light if Trisha kept digging? Was this the end, or just another chapter in a story that refused to close? The airport lights flickered overhead, casting long shadows on the floor as Rick sat alone, the reality of his actions settling in. The audience was left holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next, knowing that the real fallout was only just beginning. Trisha sat alone in the back seat of the taxi, her face turned toward the window, watching the city lights blur into streaks of color she couldn't name. Her hands were clenched in her lap, nails digging into her palms, but she barely felt the sting. The shock was still fresh, a numbness that made everything seem far away, like she was watching someone else's life unravel in slow motion. She replayed the airport scene over and over, each detail sharper than the last. The look on Rick's face when she took his phone, the way her heart dropped as she read those messages, the sound of her own voice breaking as she told him she couldn't do this anymore. The anger came next, hot and sudden, burning away the numbness and leaving her raw. How could he do this to her, after everything they'd been through? How could he stand in front of her family, look her father in the eye, and make promises he never intended to keep? The dreams she'd built, wedding, children, a life together, felt like glass shattering at her feet, impossible to piece back together. Rick, meanwhile, sat slumped in a plastic airport chair, staring at the floor as the world moved around him. He felt sorry for himself, the sting of rejection mixing with a growing sense of panic. He'd always believed he could talk his way out of anything, that a well-timed apology or a few sweet words would be enough to smooth things over. But this time felt different. He could still see the look in Trisha's eyes, the way she pulled away from him, the finality in her voice. For the first time, he wondered if he'd gone too far, if he'd finally crossed a line he couldn't come back from. The fear of losing Trisha settled in his chest, heavy and cold, and he realized how much he'd taken her for granted. As the taxi wound its way through the city, Trisha's mind drifted back to all the warning signs she'd ignored. The doubts that had crept in during quiet moments, the way Rick always seemed to have an excuse, the way he'd bristled whenever she asked for reassurance. Her family had tried to warn her, their questions sharp and insistent, their concern written in every furrowed brow and lingering glance. They'd seen the pattern before, men who promised the world but delivered only heartbreak, men who said all the right things until it was time to prove it. Trisha had wanted so badly to believe that Rick was different, that love could change even the most stubborn heart. But now, with the truth laid bare, she saw the pattern for what it was, a cycle of hope and disappointment, trust and betrayal that always seemed to end the same way. Rick's thoughts spiraled as he sat alone, replaying every moment, every choice that had led him here. He wondered if he could fix things, if there was still a chance to make Trisha believe in him again. He thought about calling her, about sending a message, about showing up at her door with flowers and apologies. But deep down, he knew that words wouldn't be enough this time. He'd broken something that couldn't be mended with promises or charm. The fear of being alone, of losing the one person who had believed in him, gnawed at him, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd brought this on himself. Trisha's phone buzzed in her bag, but she ignored it, unwilling to hear more excuses, more empty words. She needed space, needed time to process what had happened, to decide what came next. The pain was still fresh, but beneath it was a growing sense of clarity, a realization that she deserved better, that she didn't have to settle for half-truths and broken promises. She thought about her family, about the strength they'd shown, about the love they'd given her even when she couldn't see it for herself. Maybe it was time to listen, to trust her instincts, to walk away from a relationship that had given her more pain than joy. But the question lingered, heavy and unresolved. Would she find the strength to leave Rick behind, to close the door on a chapter that had defined so much of her life? Or would she give him one more chance, hoping against hope that this time would be different? And for Rick, the question was even more pressing. Could he ever change? Or was he doomed to repeat the same mistakes, hurting the people who cared about him most? The answers hung in the air, waiting as the city lights flickered outside the taxi window and the night stretched on, silent and uncertain. Trisha sat on the edge of her bed, the city's early morning light creeping through the curtains, painting everything in a soft, uncertain glow. She stared at her reflection in the mirror, searching for the girl who had walked into this relationship full of hope, who had believed that love could fix what was broken. The pain was still there, but something new had taken root. A quiet strength, a voice inside her that refused to be silenced any longer. She replayed every moment, every warning sign she'd brushed aside, the way Rick dodged questions, the way he made her feel like she was asking for too much, the way he always seemed to have a backup plan. For the first time, she saw it all clearly. These weren't random mistakes or misunderstandings. They were patterns, red flags waving in the wind, and she'd been too in love to see them for what they were. She realized now that her worth wasn't tied to Rick's promises or his approval. She didn't need someone to complete her, to validate her dreams, or to make her feel whole. She was enough, all on her own. The relief was bittersweet, a mix of sadness for what she'd lost and pride for what she'd found. She thought about all the times she'd stayed, hoping things would get better, believing that if she loved hard enough, Rick would finally become the man she needed. It was a story as old as time, holding on to hope, ignoring the pain, convincing yourself that this time would be different. But hope can be a double-edged sword, keeping you stuck in a place that only hurts you more. It's easy to judge from the outside, to wonder why someone would stay in a relationship that's clearly broken. But the truth is, leaving isn't always simple. There's the fear of being alone, the memories of better days, the belief that love can conquer anything. Sometimes, it's the small moments, the laughter, the shared dreams, the feeling of being seen that make it so hard to walk away. And sometimes, it's the hope that the person you love will finally see you, finally choose you, finally change. But real change doesn't come from pressure or ultimatums. It comes from within, from a willingness to face the truth and do the hard work. If you're watching this and you see yourself in Trisha's story, know that you're not alone. Manipulation can be subtle, wrapped in sweet words and grand gestures. It can look like love, but it feels like walking on eggshells, always wondering if you're enough. The first step is recognizing the signs, the shifting goalposts, the conditional promises, the way your needs are always just out of reach. Setting boundaries isn't selfish, it's necessary. Protecting your heart doesn't mean you've given up on love, it means you've learned to love yourself first. But is it fair to judge Rick only by his worst moments? People are complicated, and relationships are messy. Rick made promises, and maybe, in his own way, he meant them. Maybe he wanted to be better, to give Trisha the future she deserved. But good intentions don't erase the hurt, and apologies can't fix what's already broken. Sometimes, loving someone means letting them go, giving them the space to figure out who they are without dragging you down with them. Just as Trisha was starting to find her footing, her phone buzzed again. This time, it was Rick, his name lighting up the screen like a ghost from a life she was trying to leave behind. He begged for another chance, promised to change, swore that this time would be different. He said all the things she'd wanted to hear for so long, his words tumbling out in a rush of desperation and regret. For a moment, Trisha felt the old pull, the urge to believe, to forgive, to try one more time. But as she listened, she realized that nothing had changed. Not really. The choice was hers now, and for the first time, she felt strong enough to make it. Trisha waited for Rick at the cafe, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had long gone cold. She watched the door, her mind racing through every conversation, every promise, every moment she doubted herself for the sake of keeping the peace. When Rick finally walked in, he looked smaller than she remembered, weighed down by the mess he'd made and the truth he could no longer hide. He tried to smile, but Trisha didn't return it. She was done with pretending, done with hoping he'd change if she just loved him a little harder. She didn't waste time on small talk. She told him she'd seen the messages, that she knew about the late-night texts and the emotional confessions he'd shared with his ex. She laid out her boundaries, her voice steady and clear. No more secrets, no more half-truths, no more conditions on love. If he wanted to be with her, it had to be real. No more games, no more excuses, no more shifting the blame. She told him she deserved honesty, respect, and a partner who would choose her every single day, not just when it was easy. Rick listened, his eyes darting from her face to the table and back again. He started with an apology, the kind she'd heard before, full of regret and promises to do better. He said he was sorry for hurting her, sorry for lying, sorry for making her doubt herself. But as he spoke, Trisha heard the same old patterns, the vague explanations, the way he tried to make his mistakes sound like misunderstandings, the way he painted himself as the victim of circumstance. He said he'd been confused, that he never meant to hurt her, that he was scared of losing her. He begged for another chance, swore he'd cut off his ex for good, promised to start fresh. But Trisha had heard it all before. And this time, she wasn't buying it. She remembered the way her father had looked at Rick across the dinner table, the way her uncle had pressed for answers, the way her family had tried to protect her from this exact heartbreak. She thought about the culture she came from, where promises meant something, where trust was sacred, where family was everything. She thought about all the times she'd ignored her instincts, all the red flags she'd waved away because she wanted so badly to believe in love. She realized that every time she'd given Rick another chance, she'd lost a little more of herself. She took a deep breath and told Rick the truth. She couldn't do it anymore. She couldn't keep hoping he would change, couldn't keep sacrificing her happiness for someone who didn't value it. She told him she was done waiting for him to become the man she needed. She was choosing herself, her future, her peace. The words felt heavy and freeing all at once, like setting down a burden she'd carried for too long. Rick's face crumpled, the reality of her decision sinking in. He tried one last time, reaching for her hand, but Trisha pulled away. She told him she hoped he would find what he was looking for, but it wouldn't be with her. She stood up, her head high, her heart pounding, and walked out of the cafe, leaving Rick alone with his regrets. Outside, the air felt different. Lighter, cleaner, full of possibility. Trisha called her dad, her voice steady as she told him what had happened. He didn't say "I told you so." He just listened, his quiet strength wrapping around her like a blanket. She knew her family would be there for her, that she wasn't alone, that she was stronger than she'd ever realized. As she walked home, Trisha thought about everything she'd learned. Love isn't about fixing someone else or waiting for them to become who you need. It's about trust, respect, and choosing each other every day. It's about listening to your instincts, honoring your boundaries, and knowing when to walk away. She felt a sense of relief, a weight lifted, a future opening up in front of her that was hers to shape. But the story wasn't over. As Trisha scrolled through her phone that night, she saw the first signs of fallout online. Someone had posted screenshots of Rick's messages, the truth spreading faster than she could have imagined. Comments poured in, some supportive, some cruel, all hungry for the next piece of drama. Trisha's heart raced as she realized that Rick's secrets were no longer just between them. The world was watching now, and the consequences were out of her hands. Would Rick finally be held accountable for his actions, or would he find a way to spin the story in his favor? Would Trisha's decision inspire others to stand up for themselves, or would she become another cautionary tale? The questions hung in the air, unanswered, as the screen faded to black. If you thought this was the end, think again. The real drama is just getting started. What happens when the truth explodes on social media and everyone has an opinion? Will Rick's web of lies finally unravel, or is there another twist waiting in the wings? You won't want to miss what comes next.